3 years ago, I was on a call that still keeps me up at night. A teenager, just a kid really, wrapped his car around a tree. It was a mess. One of those scenes you walk into and know, deep down, that it's not going to end well. I tried everything I could, but he slipped away right there on the side of the road. I remember his eyes, the way they seemed to be searching for something. He whispered something as he faded, words I've never repeated, not even to Jenna. I've thrown myself into work ever since, trying to avoid that feeling of helplessness, trying not to think too much. Jenna's been patient, but it's wearing thin. She's tired of the long hours, the emotional distance. She says I'm here, but not really here, and I guess she's right. Then there's Mike, my partner. He's been doing this forever, always full of cryptic advice. Not every call wants to be answered, he says, and I never quite know what to make of it. I've learned to ignore most of what Mike says, chalk it up to years of dealing with too much darkness. The radio crackles, and I'm about to clock out when the dispatch comes through. Last call for the night. Gas leak incident at an abandoned house, they say, but the details are vague. The caller hung up before they could get more information. I'm annoyed, but I take it. It's the job. One last call, and then I'm done. I tell myself it'll be quick, in and out. Still, something about it feels off, like a splinter under my skin. I give Jenna a quick call, tell her I'll be late. She sighs, and I can hear the disappointment in her voice. I'll wait up, she says, but I know we'll end up arguing about it later. As I grab my gear, Mike looks at me, his expression serious. Some places don't want visitors, he mutters. I shrug it off, force a smile. Yeah, well, I'll bring back a souvenir, I say, trying to lighten the mood. He doesn't smile back. The house is on the edge of town, a place I know well enough. It's one of those spots everyone whispers about, a house with a past. When I was a teenager, my friends and I dared each other to spend the night there, but none of us had the guts. It's a place that's always seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. As we pull up, I see a rookie cop standing near the driveway, his face pale. He tells me the house doesn't look right, that he's been hearing whispers. I try to brush it off. Rookies always get jumpy. But there's a look in his eyes that I can't shake. The house is dark, the windows gaping like hollow eyes. There's no smell of gas, no obvious sign of a leak. The dispatcher says the call came from inside, but the number doesn't trace to anything. The rookie steps away, says he feels sick, and suddenly I'm alone. I push open the door, and it creaks, the sound echoing through the empty space. My flashlight cuts a narrow beam through the dust, and I step inside. It's colder in here, the air thick, heavy. I sweep the light across the room, and that's when I see them. Old medical supplies, bandages, syringes, even paramedic patches like the one on my uniform strewn across the floor. My heart skips a beat, and then I see something else. A note, folded and yellowed, with my name on it. My hands are shaking as I open it. It's dated the night of the crash, 3 years ago. I read the words, and my stomach turns. You were never meant to leave. Panic sets in. My breath's coming short and fast. Someone's messing with me. It has to be that. A cruel joke. But it doesn't feel like a joke. I turn to leave, but the door I left wide open, is shut, the handle cold and unyielding under my hand. I'm trapped. I grab my radio, call Mike, but there's nothing but static. My phone buzzes in my pocket, a text from Jenna. Where are you? Please hurry. My mind flashes back to that night, the boy in the car. I remember his voice, barely a whisper. You were never meant to leave, he'd said. I thought it was just delirium, the ramblings of someone slipping away, but now the words are pounding in my head, echoing off the walls of this dark, empty house. A noise from upstairs, a creak, a voice, my name. I know I should leave, find another way out, but something pulls me forward. Up the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. At the top, there's a door, slightly ajar, and beyond it, I see an old photograph pinned to the wall. It's me, as a teenager, standing in front of this house, a grin on my face. I don't remember this picture. My flashlight flickers, and then I see it. A shadow, a figure standing just behind me, whispering those same words. You were never meant to leave. Everything goes black. When I come to, I'm in the ambulance, parked outside the house. My head is pounding, my hands trembling as I fumble for the keys. I don't remember getting here. Don't remember anything after that shadow. The house looms in the rearview mirror, dark and silent, and I feel a chill that sinks deep into my bones. I make it home, and Jenna is waiting, her eyes red from worry. I pull her close, hold her tighter than I ever have before. I try to explain, but the words won't come. Something happened in that house, something I can't shake. I promise her I'll be better, that I'll be here, really be here. But even as I say it, I feel the weight of something unresolved pressing down on me. Mike retires the next week, leaves a note in my locker that just says, "Sometimes the job follows you home." I don't know what he knew, but I can't help feeling like he's right. Jenna's trying. She wants to be supportive, but she knows something's changed. I've stopped taking late calls, avoid anything that might bring me near that house, but the coincidences keep piling up. Little things, voices on the radio, shadows that move when they shouldn't. I keep telling myself it's just my mind playing tricks, but I'm not so sure anymore. I've decided I need to know the truth. About the house, about that night, about why it feels like something is following me. I've started keeping notes, writing everything down, determined to piece it together. I can't keep running from it. As I leave my shift tonight, I catch a glimpse in the rearview mirror, the rookie cop from that night, standing by the house, his lips moving silently. I know what he's saying. You were never meant to leave. And I know this isn't over. Story 2. It was the last shift of my dead-end job, and I was sitting in the break room, scrolling through my phone, waiting for the hours to tick by. The department store was shutting down for good, and as the janitor, I'd been given the wonderful task of clearing out the basement storage. Probably the last thing I'd ever do for this place. I'd grown up in this neighborhood. The store had been a landmark back then, and now it was just another memory fading out. The basement, though, had always felt strange. I remembered a school field trip when I'd wandered down there and heard whispers, faint and impossible to explain. "Yo, don't forget to leave the mop," Ryan had joked earlier. My best friend. He was always the voice in my head telling me to get out of here, to start fresh and do something better. "Quit wasting time. Go to trade school. Stop cleaning floors," he'd say. He wasn't wrong, just annoying sometimes. There was also Mia, who used to work here. She quit last week, left for something better. Maybe that's what I should have done too, but I had been putting it off. Truth be told, I'd always had a soft spot for Mia. I wondered if she'd think it was brave or just dumb for me to be going down there tonight. "Hey, we've been getting complaints about noises in the basement," my manager told me before he left for the night. "Check it out before you finish up." Great, just what I needed. I sighed, flipping through my phone for a distraction. "Bet it's ghosts. Call me if you don't make it out," Ryan texted back when I asked for some moral support. Always helpful, that guy. The basement had always had a reputation. Rumors about a curse, about someone disappearing down there. My dad worked at this store back in the day. He told me the stories about an old janitor who went missing decades ago. I always thought it was just something to scare the new hires, but now, as I grabbed my flashlight and keys, I couldn't help but feel a chill. "I'm heading down. If I don't text back, it's your fault," I typed out to Ryan. I approached the basement door, the metal cool under my hand. The key didn't want to turn at first, like the lock itself was refusing me entry. When it finally gave way, the door creaked open, the sound echoing down the stairwell. I flicked on the flashlight, and it blinked, dimming for a moment before holding steady. Of course it would choose tonight to act up. Ryan had mentioned Mia earlier, that she called asking about me. That small flicker of hope almost made me smile as I stepped down into the basement. Maybe there was something worth getting out of this place for after all. The air was stale, and each step seemed to creak louder than the last. I pushed the door closed behind me, the darkness swallowing the sound. The basement was colder than I remembered, and not just because it was dark. It felt different, like the air itself was thicker. I scanned the shelves, my light cutting through dust and shadows. That's when I noticed it. An old clock hanging on the far wall. The hands were frozen at 11:56 p.m., and for just a second, I swear the second hand twitched when my light hit it. Then nothing. Guess I should fix the clock too, I muttered, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my neck. I started checking the shelves, calling out to see if it was just an animal. The clock ticked once, loud enough to echo through the room, and then stopped again. "Ryan, I found a creepy clock," I texted. "Don't touch it, that's how people die in horror movies," he shot back. I chuckled, shaking my head, but the laughter felt hollow in the empty space. I turned back to the shelves, my flashlight catching the edge of a cracked mirror. I caught my reflection, tired eyes, dust clinging to my uniform. And for a moment, I heard my dad's voice. "This job's a dead end, kid." He was right, and seeing myself there, in that dim basement, I felt it. The guilt of not moving on, not taking that step forward, just staying in the same place, running the same routine. I sighed and turned away from the mirror, deciding I'd get this done and be out of here for good. Then I heard it. The ticking again, louder, faster. I turned toward the clock, and my flashlight flickered, just enough to throw shadows across the walls. The air grew colder, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I needed to leave. I turned back to the door, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. My heart started pounding, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. I rattled the handle, but it felt like it had fused with the frame. The clock struck midnight, even though it had been stopped before. The chime was deafening in the silence, and then came a loud thud from behind the shelves. My flashlight wavered as I turned, and that's when I saw it. A trapdoor beneath a stack of old crates. I hesitated, every instinct screaming to leave, but something about it called to me. It felt like if I didn't open it, I'd regret it forever. Ryan's name flashed on my phone, a call. His voice came through, half joking, half concerned. "Hey, Mia wants to meet up later. You alive down there?" I swallowed hard, staring at the trapdoor. "I'll call you back," I said, and hung up, shoving the phone in my pocket. My hands moved before my mind could argue, pushing the crates aside, lifting the heavy wooden door. A set of stairs led further down, into darkness that seemed impossibly deep. I started down, each step echoing like a heartbeat. The walls were different, newer, cleaner, like they didn't belong in this dusty old building. It didn't make sense. At the bottom, I found a small room, dimly lit by a bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was a folder on a table, my name written on it in bold letters. My heart pounded as I opened it, finding page after page of details about my life, where I lived, my shifts, notes about my dad. And on the last page, scrawled in red ink, "It ends here, midnight, 1981. Footsteps echoed behind me, slow, deliberate. I turned, my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. There was nothing there, just the stairs I had come down, but the footsteps continued, closer now, and a faint laugh echoed from somewhere above. My breath caught, and I turned back to the table, gripping the edge, trying to steady myself. "This better be worth it," I muttered, my voice barely a whisper. In the corner of the room, I saw something. A figure hunched over, barely visible in the shadows. "Hey!" I called out, my voice cracking. But when I took a step forward, the figure vanished. My flashlight caught the glint of another clock on the wall. This one stopped at midnight, the date reading 1981. My phone was dead when I tried to check the time. Panic started to rise, my breaths coming in short gasps, but I forced myself to focus. I couldn't lose it now. There was a narrow door at the back of the room. I rushed over, yanking it open, and found what looked like a manager's office. Papers scattered across a desk, a chair tipped over. It was like no one had been here in decades, but everything was intact. untouched by time. I rifled through the documents, finding old reports about staff disappearing between 11 p.m. and midnight. Names I didn't recognize, until I found one that made me stop. My dad's old friend, the one who'd vanished when I was 6. Footsteps echoed louder now, right outside the office. I shoved the desk against the door, my heart pounding in my ears, searching for another way out. The desk drawer held a set of keys, one labeled Last Shift Key. I grabbed it just as the door flew open, and suddenly, I was back in the basement. The clock on the wall read 11:56 p.m., the second hand ticking steadily again. I stood there staring at it, realization washing over me. This was a cycle, one I'd somehow become a part of, just like all the others before me. My dad had known somehow, and now it was my turn. I heard a voice behind me, soft, familiar. I turned, and there he was, a younger version of my dad, his eyes filled with the same fear I felt. "Leave," he whispered. "Leave before midnight." I grabbed the keys, my resolve hardening. I wasn't going to let this place take me. Not tonight. At 11:59, I raised the wrench I'd found on the shelf and swung it at the clock, shattering the glass, the ticking stopping instantly. The air seemed to shift, the darkness retreating as sunlight suddenly flooded the room. I blinked, and I was back in the break room, the manager standing over me, frowning. "You're late," he said, shaking his head. I looked around, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, the sounds of the store waking up. I touched my pocket, feeling the cold metal of the key. I whispered to myself, it wasn't just a story after all. Story 3. It was my last shift at the warehouse, and I was sitting on the forklift, staring into the empty expanse of the distribution center. Most of the shelves were bare, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead echoing in the emptiness. 10 years in this place, a decade of lifting boxes, sweating through heavy overtime, and barely scraping by. It was supposed to be over tonight. I was supposed to finally leave this behind, get something better, something for Ethan. Ethan, my 7-year-old son, was the reason I kept going. Divorced, living paycheck to paycheck, he was my motivation to get up every day, even if it meant coming here. He'd ask me questions sometimes about my job. I always made it sound better than it was, telling him stories about the forklifts and big boxes, about the long rows of shelves filled with secrets. I tried to make it sound like an adventure instead of the dead-end job it really was. My dad worked here once, a long time ago, before he left, under circumstances no one really talked about. He used to tell me stories about the warehouse, about strange noises, about voices in the storage rooms. I'd brushed it off, just the ramblings of a tired man, until tonight. "Hey, last shift, huh?" Jake called out, walking up to me. He was my best friend here, the only guy who could make this place feel a little less like a prison. "Can't believe it's all shutting down. This place has got a few ghosts, you know that?" He laughed, nudging me with his elbow. Yeah, ghosts," I smirked. Jake had always joked about the place being haunted, and maybe that's why I was getting that uneasy feeling in my stomach. Or maybe it was because the shift supervisor had just handed me one last task: catalog a bunch of mislabeled items in the restricted upper-level storage unit. The one that was always supposed to be off limits. "Why now?" I had asked, but all I got was a shrug. "Just get it done tonight," he said, his tone unusually insistent. It rubbed me the wrong way, but I wasn't about to argue. Last night, last task, and then I'm done. Before heading up, I gave Ethan a quick call to say goodnight. He was excited, babbling about something he did at school, but before he hung up, he joked, "Don't let the warehouse ghosts get you, Dad." I laughed, but it didn't reach my eyes. It was like everyone could feel something off about tonight. I grabbed my inventory clipboard, a flashlight, and a radio. Jake looked at me as I headed to the stairwell. "If you don't come back, I'm keeping your parking spot," he called. The stairwell leading up to the restricted area was dim. Several of the bulbs burnt out, casting long shadows on the cracked concrete. My flashlight flickered as soon as I turned it on. Of course it did. I shook it until the light steadied, then made my way up. The access door was rusted, the key barely fitting into the lock. I had to force it, the metal grinding loudly before it finally gave way. Inside, it was cold. Colder than it should have been. My breath misted in front of me, and the place smelled of dust and old wood. I swept the flashlight across the room, stacks of furniture covered in dusty tarps, and in the far corner, a bunch of unmarked crates that didn't match anything on the inventory list. I sighed, my breath clouding the air, and made my way over to them. One of the crates was slightly open, and something inside caught my eye. Papers, old and yellowed. I pulled the top open wider, revealing dusty file folders. I picked one up, my name catching my eye. My father's name was printed across the top, with incident report stamped in red ink. My stomach dropped. I opened it, the pages trembling slightly in my hands. There were notes, dates, descriptions of strange occurrences, whispers, shadows, things disappearing. My dad had written some of these notes himself, his handwriting unmistakable. There was a mention of the restricted storage area, this room. I felt a chill run down my spine, the same kind of chill I remembered from when I was a kid, listening to my dad tell his stories. I pulled out my phone, dialing Jake. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, you're not dead yet, right?" he joked. I tried to laugh, but it came out shaky. "Jake, there's something here. About my dad. Something happened up here." There was a pause. "Maybe your dad knew something we don't," he said, trying to keep it light, but I could hear the unease in his voice. I set the folder down, my fingers brushing the edge of the crate. That's when I heard it. A faint noise, almost like a whisper, coming from deeper within the storage area. I turned, my flashlight sweeping across the tarps and crates, but there was nothing there, just the dark. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Let's just get this done," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. I made my way towards the back, the whispers growing louder, more distinct. There was something else, a door, half hidden behind a stack of old furniture. It looked older, made of heavy wood, the kind you don't see in buildings like this anymore. My heart pounded as I reached for the handle, the metal cold against my skin. I pushed it open, and the air inside was colder still, almost frigid. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing off the walls, plunging me into darkness. My flashlight flickered, and then went out completely. Panic surged through me, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I banged on the door, but it wouldn't budge. I thought of Ethan, of how I'd promised to see him tomorrow. I had to get out of here. For him. Jake's voice crackled through the radio, filled with static. "Hey, where'd you go? You're not answering." His voice was faint, almost drowned out by other voices whispering beneath his words. I tried to respond, but the radio cut out, the static growing louder. I stumbled forward, my hands outstretched until they met something solid, a desk. My fingers brushed against old papers, and I felt around until I found a lighter, flicking it on. The flame cast a dim, flickering light, revealing an abandoned office. The equipment was ancient, the papers yellowed with age, dated from the 1960s. There was a crate against the far wall, labeled with my father's name and the words, "Do not open." I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. I had to know. "This is for you, Dad," I whispered, prying the crate open. Inside there was a journal, the cover worn and cracked. I opened it, the pages filled with my father's handwriting. He detailed strange occurrences, voices, shadows, things that shouldn't exist. On the last page, a note addressed to me, "If you're reading this, you didn't listen. Get out before midnight." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and among them, I heard Ethan's voice. He was calling for help. My heart lurched, and I turned towards the sound, the lighter flickering as I moved. There was a rusted janitor's cart in the corner, and I remembered my dad's friend who'd disappeared, the one everyone said had just walked away from the job. It felt like everything was falling into place, and none of it made sense. The room began to shake, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. I shouted into the darkness, demanding answers, but the only response was the laughter echoing from the walls. I felt tears sting my eyes, frustration and fear boiling over. I remembered my father's last words to me before he left. "There's nothing here worth saving, son." Maybe he'd been right. A shadow moved in the corner of the room and I turned, the lighter flickering. It was a figure, my father, or something that looked like him, its face distorted, wrong. I grabbed a metal rod from the floor, swinging it, but the figure vanished, leaving behind only darkness and an open path, another door, one that hadn't been there before. I stumbled through it, finding myself back in the main part of the basement. My watch read 11:56 p.m., but my phone, which had suddenly come back to life, showed that 2 hours had passed. I could hear Jake's voice calling out, panicked, and I followed it, finding him near the access door, his face pale. "Where the hell have you been?" he asked, his voice shaky. "You were gone for hours." Later, when I got home, I read through the journal again. My father had left clues, warnings. He'd known what was happening, what this place was. As I tucked Ethan into bed that night, I saw a shadow move in the corner of the room, and I heard it. A faint whisper, almost like a promise. "It's not over."